The reason we're here tonight is to talk with my neighbor here, General Peter Zwack, retired U.S. Army. General Zwack, his bio is in everybody's program, so I won't go into too many details. But he just recently completed a 34-year career in the United States Army with senior posts in Afghanistan, in the Balkans, in Korea, and most recently as the senior U.S. defense attaché at the embassy in Moscow. So this is somebody who's got tremendous insight, tremendous views on what's happening in Russia and in Ukraine and in East-West relations. He and I were in my office about a month ago and lost a couple of hours just talking about what was happening in that part of the world. And I said, Peter, why don't we do this in front of a room of our closest friends? And he agreed. And so, ladies and gentlemen, Peter Zwack. General, it's a pleasure to have you with us tonight, and we're met at a propitious moment, at a significant moment in U.S. Russian relations. It was a year ago yesterday that the Russian Federation, the Duma, voted to annex Crimea, a verb that we thought had been expunged from Western history in the last century. It was a year ago tomorrow that Russia formally took control of Crimea after that. And over the last 2 years, we've seen Russia more assertive, more aggressive in its relations with its neighbors. We know that there is a war being fought in Ukraine now over part of that country's relationship with Russia. We know that Russia's neighbors are nervous. Poland and in the Baltic states. Lithuania today voted to bring back mandatory conscription. So young Lithuanians will be forced to serve in the military because of this crisis. Paramilitary units are forming in Poland. Tensions are ratcheting up. And then we've got the whole issue of political violence in Russia. So a lot for us to talk about. But I thought tonight we would start with Russia's history. It has a rich history. It has a sense of historic risk and threat. Maybe you could walk us through the way Russia looks at its neighborhood and its own history of threat.
Okay. First of all, it's an honor to be invited this evening. I know I've got a tough crowd here, very, very well-informed crowd. And we're going to be talking extemporaneously, so we'll see where we go. Russia. First of all, I would submit that every country, every state has its history, and its history in many ways guides its behavior, the way it sees the world. I would, in the case of the Russian Federation, I'd multiply that by 2 or 3. And if one can even attempt to understand where the Russians are thinking, you've got to make an attempt to understand their history. I don't purport to understand their history because I'm not Russian and I don't live in their skin. But I've certainly been reading a lot about it, and I've certainly been living it by being over. So let's go look at the map for a minute and just review. I know you all know this, but first of all, let's take a look at where we are here. This is a vast nation, 11 time zones. It is the Eurasian nation. It borders, it starts at it borders Europe, and then all the way out to the Far East in People's Republic of China. In this 11 time zones, you have a very, very, first of all, you have a huge demographic challenge. About 80% of Russia, the Urals is about here, the Ural Mountains, is west. About 20% is from the Urals out to Vladivostok. So they have major geostrategic challenges already. In a population, in a country of this, what do you think their population is? Every time I look at it, I can't believe it. About plus or minus 145 to 150 million people. Ours is we're almost 320 million. And, that has to basically, you live in this vast area. Much of the north is barely habitable. Population density is about 21 per square mile. In the United States, it's 80. And so, it is also underpopulated in a lot of areas. I just give you this perspective. The borders. You've got a 2,500-mile border with China. By the way, a good piece of China in the Far East was annexed by Tsarist Russia in the mid-1800s, okay? If you remember, the Soviet Union and Russia and China had border wars in the 60s up in the Amur and Ussuri River. They buried the hatchet. Putin did that in 2003. It's not an issue now, but it is still part of the long history. Then you move down. You have Central Asia, which, by the way, used to be part of the old Soviet Union. And you have Afghanistan here. In Russia, here the paradox of Russia is that while they could not stand the thought of the United States and NATO operating in this region after through Partnership for Peace and then after 9/11, the paradox is in my last few years in Moscow, the Russians said, why are you leaving Afghanistan? We don't want you to leave. Because they understand that they have a very, very undergoverned, shallow, underpopulated region, and if Afghanistan centrally implodes, then all the furies of drugs and extremism and all of that, potentially infects even more Central Asia and their south. Then you've got the Caucasus, and restive. You have an incipient insurgency in a place called Dagestan, and Chechnya is in here. And then you have the West. History. Rus, which is Kiev, old Kiev. Early 1200s, the Mongols erupt out, and they put much of this region to the sword, including Kiev, which leads you to the city-states of Muscovy and all that, basically pulling together and finally fending them off. So in the 1200s, in this part of the world, the Mongols were that era's, if you will, equivalent of a thermonuclear weapon. It was horrific. When the Mongols arrived, you knew your city was going to be gone. Okay. All right, so you have all these challenges on this long border, and then finally there's Europe. And we think, and I went to Moscow and many others before and those after, the West, this should be the one area, especially today, where Russia works to normalize relationships. They don't need problems here because they got potential problems everywhere else. And yet, as one old woman tugged on my sleeve when I was trying to say, the West is no threat. NATO's no threat. She says, but remember, General, in the lifetime of myself as being a little girl and of my parents, Nazi jackboots were on the throats of most of our villages and towns in European Russia, and over 25 million of us died in 4 years. And so when you say that, you kind of just sit back, you try to explain, and then you just want to hug her. You don't know what to say. So they have a history with the West too. Napoleon came out of there, and everything else. And I would submit that their history is a large piece of what's driving their views of existential threats, real, perceived, and unfortunately, in the case of this government, contrived.
That's great. So we're gonna have a little conversation here. I'm gonna, in about 20 minutes, open the floor to conversation as well. So if you've got those questions, make note of them, and we'll get to you in just a little bit. General, I wonder if you could dig a little bit deeper on the crisis with Ukraine in particular. What's Russia doing, and what are their intentions?
First of all, historically, I think that that Russia, Soviet Union, Ukraine, and Russia have been inextricably linked throughout history. And Ukraine, unfortunately, in its associations with Russia, especially the Soviet Union, usually didn't come out well for them. So it's a tough history. Yet the nations are so intermixed ethnically, and it's hard to separate them in many ways. The current round of problems, I would submit, would begin. Well, first of all, Ukraine, of course, separates in 1991. And this doesn't this doesn't excuse any of the egregious behaviors that the Russians have been involved with in past years. But imagine if you're a Russian patriot, that in the stroke of a clock in 1991, 14 of your 15 republics are gone, mostly peacefully. And frankly, it was a miracle. Well, Ukraine was perhaps the biggest chunk, both physically and economically and emotionally, cut out of Russia. All right, 2004, you had the you had the revolution in Kiev, and that was the first time that the Russians saw problems with Ukraine. It was trying to break away to the west, if you will, from Russia, if you will, Russian influence. Fast forward to 2011 and 12, you had President Yanukovych, a pro-Russian president of Ukraine, basically has to flee for his life after Maidan, and you all saw what happened in Maidan Square. And this, for the Russians, was, at least in Putin regime's sort of blinkered view of the world, was a catastrophe. Because not only did they lose a close ally, but they felt that they were losing Ukraine. And then all the conspiracy theories started to come out that the U.S. was going to put a base in Crimea, and they were spinning out, and they were going to become part of the European Union, and then by extension NATO. So it really, the Russians start to go postal at this time. Yanukovych flees in 2012 February, and Putin becomes the new president in 2012. By the way, I've got my dates screwed up. Okay, Putin becomes president in 2012, and just a year ago, Yanukovych flees. Okay, I'm talking about the 2011-2012 Bolotnaya, Moscow riots and demonstrations that really upset the Russians, because it appeared to be regime change. They blamed the U.S. And then a year later, Yanukovych flees. Putin is in power, and then this leads to a number of tough situations, ultimately leading to the Crimean annexation that you all know about. So Ukraine is mother's milk in the nationalist Russia's mind, and we're living it now.
So I hear you describing a series of reactions to perceived threat, but is there reason to believe that there's also some other strategic intent in Putin's behavior in particular? And I want to make sure I get this right. There's a Moscow-based scholar by the name of Yuval Weber, who had an op-ed in the Washington Post yesterday morning. And he basically argued that Russia's intention is to restructure the entire post-Cold War settlement. And specifically, they want, one, a collective security agreement with Russia, the U.S., and leading states in Europe. Two, a supranational security council that would trump NATO in Europe. And three, a Russian sphere of influence in the former Soviet space. Is that accurate?
I would submit that the Russians are thinking, while their actions may appear offensive, that they are strategically defensive and preemptive. In Ukraine, again, if you subscribe to the view that they see NATO as the ultimate threat, somehow In Ukraine and Belarus, they have a buffer, and these are old. These are pre-Cold War. These are Cold War thoughts. Ideally, we were moving away in the post-Cold War system. Buffer zones, conventional threats, and all of that. But I would submit in the Russian view that they need space. Ukraine has a population of 40 to 45 million people. It's big. It's industrial. It's also agricultural. And they need to keep control here. I would submit that it is defensive in nature. Plus, and this is getting at what you're saying, they don't like the fact that EU is a economic and political bloc. I would submit that it is a strategic intent to try to divide the EU nations, and you're seeing that going on already. There's, along with Greece and some of the southern tier countries, and even Hungary, they've been able to stoke the nationalist parties, ideally to I think, create doubt and to break up EU, which tangentially could possibly lead to a fracture within NATO in a crisis in Europe.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions, a lot of follow-up that we could go on any of these, but I want to throw out a few more issues first. I'm reminded of an old adage from my days as a student of American foreign policy, looking at Mexico, and scholars have often said of Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States. And you can adopt that adage for the people of Ukraine right now, so far from God, so close to Russia. My question, though, would be, is there more that the United States could or should be doing to support the government in Ukraine, the people of Ukraine, in this fight against separatists in the eastern part of the country?
Jim, could you put the map up of Ukraine for me? This is a devil of a situation because, first of all, Ukraine is not part of any alliance system. All right, so in this difficult world, and there's a book by a guy called Snyder called The Bloodlands. This is in the heart of the old bloodlands between Stalin and Hitler in the Second World War. They're caught in between. Ukraine, Krai, means boundary, border, and they are through that. So they suffer in somewhat. They rely on the largesse of their neighbors, ideally, peace-abiding neighbors, to survive. As far as Ukraine, geopolitically or geographically, you can see here, you've got, the bulk of Western Ukraine is whatever you would call, is homogeneously Ukrainian. Here you move into the eastern Ukraine, which you read a lot about, and there it is leavened very, very heavily with Russians, but, and this is what is very, very important, these are not monolithically Russian-dominated areas. So they're interspersed with Ukrainians, and traditionally they got on actually pretty well. But it took agents provocateurs, external forces, propaganda, to start to kind of break these areas up. So you've got this area, Luhansk and Donetsk, which are more heavily Russian than Ukrainian, but you still got about 30% Ukrainian, though there are many refugees here. Crimea was about 60% plus or minus Russian, with a long history with Russia. And then you can see that the farther west you go, except for this area down here toward Odessa and a place called Transnistria, the population diffuses into a more Ukrainian. You have Cossacks in there and Russians. So one of the, I would believe that Crimea was a slickly done operation, and it was an illegal annexation. But I would say that the Russians, at this point, after the fall of the Yanukovych government a year ago, the prevalent view, probably 80% is of the population, is don't hurt my head with legal reasons. This is our land, this is our traditional land, and these are our people. And I think that is justification to do it. And then they created the legal justifications for it. What is interesting here is that there are many of us that think that the Russians had a broader view for much of eastern Ukraine up to the Dnieper River, to include Kharkiv in this area. And it didn't go so well for the Russians after Crimea in this area. They got in fairly easily in the beginning, but they bogged down. And part of bogging down in supporting these separatists, there's a term for a lot of this area called thugland. It's sort of a moniker. Was that that a lot of these areas where there are also a lot of Ukrainians didn't want any part of it. So this didn't rot out like these areas did. And what they have managed to do is coalesce with this annexation, but really this invasion, its aggression. It's a veiled aggression, but it's going on. Is that they have coalesced in the bulk of Ukraine a mainstream sense of patriotism that didn't exist, I would submit, a year ago. It was there. I was Ukrainian, I'm Ukrainian and all that, but now they really, really feel it. And the Ukrainians are fighting. Now, their military isn't particularly well trained or well staffed or even well equipped, but they did not roll in this area. And it's presented the Russians with some major, major challenges.
Now, the British government yesterday announced that they were going to send trainers to help the Ukrainian military get up to speed. We know that Ukraine has asked the United States for specific hardware. I smile when they talk about it as being defensive weapons because if they're lethal weapons, they're lethal weapons. The question I would put to you is, in that swirl of policy debates and understanding that you've been retired for a few months now, should the United States be providing lethal assistance to the Ukrainians?
Yeah, and I need to answer your prior question. One, I believe in the sanctions. Because when you, this is a country, again, outside of alliance system, and in the current context, nobody's going to go to war for Ukraine, or certainly nobody in the West. So this makes it really, really challenging. And the sanctions, when you're dealing with a pseudo-democratic, authoritarian kleptocracy in a sort of a combination of a pseudo-presidential, czar-like mafia don type of leadership in senior level regime, the bottom line counts, meaning the dollar and the ruble counts. And if you're in a system like Putin, where he has to deal with, right now, if I'm in Putin's mind, I'm thinking, got to maintain power. I've got to maintain that power, I've got to maintain loyalty. Yeah. And through that, I need to sell and maintain my legitimacy. In all of that, I need to do things to keep the momentum going positively, and the news, part of it is propaganda. To do all this, it makes it hard. So the sanctions actually have hurt. And when you couple that black swan for them that occurred about 2.5 months ago, the whole economy tanking, with the oil prices going down, and the inflation going up, and the ruble going, that was a perfect storm for them at this time. So the sanctions are good. We don't want to do it. It hurts. The EU hates it. They would like it to end as quickly as possible. But how do you get at this cabal around Putin that have major moneyed interests? And that's part of the patronage that Putin dispenses the access to power and money. So sanctions, and then, of course, now here we go to the question of defensive weapons. Ladies and gentlemen, I was against weapons into Ukraine because I was concerned, like many others, it would be inflammatory, potentially escalatory. And they've had two Minsk rounds, two Minsk peace attempts, if you will, accords. First one failed dismally, what now, about over half a year ago now, and then the other one is foundering right now. And about 4 months ago, I have now reluctantly moved into the camp where the West, not the world, not just the United States, but a coalition of concerned nations, not NATO, but a coalition of concerned nations, give the Ukrainians those defensive weapons that can even the playing field. And the message to the Russians is very simple. If you don't attack, they're not going to be knocking your tanks out. So stop, okay? Because it was proven last summer in July and August that Russian main force units were in Ukraine. They maintain the fiction, which is an extraordinary thing. It's an extraordinary thing when your leaders are being told by Russians at the very most senior level that we don't have forces in Ukraine. And you get some four-star general that's trying to have a conversation or whatever, or somebody else. I can't believe that he lied to me this way. And you know, he knows that I know that he lied to me. But I'm not the audience. The audience is inside Russia. The audience is inside the EU. The audience is basically to create doubt, to create on the EU side and us too, enough doubt where we decide not to throw the sanctions bin at them. So, when Air Malaysia got shot down, good God, 200 Dutch killed on it. I mean, this was the other black swan for Putin and company. Was not part of the Russian plan. They did not. It was not by design. I believe that their separatists with Russian equipment shot it down, and it was a mess. And the news for Russia started to tack negatively since then. So, sanctions, and now I do support enhanced defensive weapons. And thirdly, we need to, could we go to the bigger map, please, again? We need to show our allies reassurance that they're part of NATO, and darn it, Russia, back off. Don't try it. Don't try the little green men in the Baltics. And Jim had some really, really good pictures of a New York Times article recently. The Poles know the Russians. They know them deep. It's mother's milk. And no, by the way, nobody wants to go to war. I want to say this, I believe, including the Russians. But they're going to push. They're going to poke. They're going to intimidate. And when you're in an environment like this with a lot of bad history and a lot of bad feelings, bad things can happen. Poles get it. They are training. They're even further arming. One of the paradoxes of Russia poking the West is that they are creating they're making, in my mind, a gigantic strategic mistake. Right. Because they're doing exactly what they don't want. And that they are now forcing NATO to reevaluate its own defensive scheme and what we call Article 5, which is mutual defense. And if you remember, up until a year and a half ago, NATO's chief focus was engagement in the West in Afghanistan. And now you've got NATO in a real serious introspection of its mission. The other big Russian miscalculation was that somehow, and while it's half-hearted, they have managed to really irritate major chunks of the European Union. And that wasn't part of their plan strategically as well.
I'm gonna ask one more question, and then I'm gonna look to you to contribute to this. So we've seen some pretty shocking political violence in the shadow of the Kremlin. The murder of Boris Nemtsov shocked a lot of people, and appears, according to some reports, to have opened some fissures within the security elements within Russian society. What's your take on those reports and what's happening there?
And the right questions, what's my take? Because I'm laying out pure conjecture. Okay, pure conjecture.
And I would also ask you just to think about, too, in terms of what does this tell us about the overall stability of Russia?
I mean, again, Russia's behaviors, especially in the last month, have been absolutely bizarre and Byzantine and suspicious and conspiracy theories. I mean, it goes back to the court of a potentate, you know, and it's not normal. You know, whatever you want a government, I call Russia now a regime. I don't really use the term government anymore. It's off, really, really off. And the assassination of Boris Nemtsov, who'd been loomed large, had loomed large for 25 years in the Russian political landscape, was a deputy prime minister one time, was, I think, a shock even for a lot of the Russians that are all in with Putin. Now, I don't know, and in my gut, I don't think that Putin ordered the killing of Boris Nemtsov. But I think that one could say is that the climate that this regime has inculcated inside Russia and the allies and those that want to curry favor, look up this guy, Ramzan Kadyrov, this Chechen guy who is slavishly loyal to Putin, the current president of Chechnya. And you know, and so there are all kinds of conspiracy theories, including we were behind it, but when in doubt, blame the Chechens. Okay, so he's gunned down, and again, it's the poisonous internal environment that led to that, and then just these behaviors of the last 2 weeks, and I don't think that the Russians, the leadership thought this one through. When Putin disappeared for 10 days, you know, all what that set off inside Russia was a Pandora's box of conspiracy theory and suspicions and, oh, you know, he's with this mistress. No, there's been a coup, you know. And I would submit that even opening those words up inside the Russian, if you will, body politic starts to create some fissures that they didn't necessarily anticipate. Because guess what? Those thoughts are coming from among Russians and not from the American CIA and NATO trying to inculcate regime change thoughts in Russia. So it has been a really, really strange a few weeks. Russia is mutating in some really, really unsavory way. I don't know where this is headed. But I think, if, again, to close on this, if with Nemtsov and what is going on, again, I would go back to Putin's mind. How do I retain power? And how do I retain loyalty? And what patronage do I and in all of this, how do I maintain my legitimacy? And how do I create those circumstances to maintain the momentum for all of it? I think he's a bit like a predatory shark. And what do sharks have to do to survive? They have to keep moving. Okay, so hopefully that helped.
That's a great kicking off. So, questions from the audience, raise your hand and I'll come running to you with the microphone. Right in the back.
A couple of questions. One is the map that you showed of the current states, Ukraine and the Baltic states and Belarus. to me, it would look like if you think about it, it's what the map looked like in, let's say, October 1918, at the end of World War I, when the German army had defeated the Russians and the Russians had abandoned the near abroad. But that near abroad had been part of Russia since Poltava, at least, so 300 years. So when Americans, it seems to me, when Americans talk about, well, why are they so upset about this? I mean, they're independent and free countries. If we had owned, I don't know, Texas or Oklahoma or something, or Florida for 300 years, and they suddenly declared their independence in a moment where, as a country, we had an economic, political collapse, it would be difficult to give up, particularly if you're an ex-KGB agent. So I'm making a speech, but I'm wondering whether or not this effort to reclaim, perhaps in Putin's mind, is something that he has a once in a lifetime, maybe once in forever chance to do. That that strategically he cannot abandon the opportunity to recover 300 years of Russian history, however uncomfortable that might make everybody else in the West.
Sir, I think your point is very well taken. I think now the challenge for Russia, and again, they are still working through proxies, is how do you match capability with desire? And I would submit that, yeah, a lot of them probably have the desire to bring all of Ukraine back into the fold. But as we talked about, I don't think the Ukrainians will fight. And this is a Russian military that, short of a full mobilization, it is stressed to even man it with 1 million people. Again, going back to the demographics. But you're exactly right about the West and Poltava, because not only did we talk about the Nazis and the French, but you had the Livonians, Lithuanians, you had the Swedes. So this is a country that historically has maintained threats from every azimuth. And yes, I would submit, I would agree with you that there is probably a line of strategic thinking, that we need to get our buffer back, we need to get back to our near abroad. But the problem is that now this country has its own mind. And while they're not necessarily, I don't think Ukrainians are pathologically anti-Russian, but they are pro-Ukrainian now. And that is a big change than even a few years ago. And maybe another interesting data point is Belarus, with all of this, has been very cagey. Very, strong Russian ally, but trying to also put its own imprint on its own foreign policy and kind of telling the Russians, we don't totally buy into what you're doing. But yes, I would agree with you in your broad premise. If I'm a Russian strategic thinker and a patriot and a nationalist, I'd like to some way have control of these areas for the reasons that you suggest.
Back.
General, to what extent would you comment on the degree to which power is concentrated in Putin?
Yeah, short and succinct. And I think, it's interesting. I think that the answer might have been different even a month or two ago. I don't think, maybe it's a little bit weakened today, that there has been a Russian leader, Russian/Soviet leader since Stalin, with so much concentrated, relatively unchecked power and access to making quick decisions than Vladimir Putin. I would say that Khrushchev, which we all saw as a strong Russian-Soviet leader, we saw it culminate with the missile crisis in '62. He's had to look over his shoulder at the Politburo. It was constantly scheming, and ultimately he's put out by that. So he's got enormous power. He's very, very close, unfortunately, to that nuclear trigger, which, when the Russians want to intimidate, they don't want to go to nuclear war, but they will remind us they have this capability. And that really is in this age, I think, is at the fount, if you will, the heart of their coercive power. On a bad day, he's the most dangerous man in the world. I would submit that, and then in the last month or two, that there are some cracks and fissures in the facade, and we don't know how this is going to play out. That help?
Much as our country has changed over the last 2 generations, from World War II and the demographics and on, how do you see that the Russian population has changed over the last 2 generations, and what kind of support or lack of support would they have with Putin's vision?
Let's go back toward the mid-'80s. Going back, we got to go back a generation, 2 generations. And I throw this out as a thought, that anybody over 45 in Russia today remembers a failing Soviet Union and a system, a government that ultimately collapses primarily due to economic reasons. So while there is that 85% that supports Putin that we all read about today, if the economic hardships persist and pointing the fingers at everybody else in the world and as the reason for the internal Russian problems, at a certain point, it's going to turn inward on them. How Russia has changed, I think that they went through a cathartic moment. I was in Russia a lot. Hey, I must sound like a Cold Warrior. I'm one that actually fundamentally likes the Russians. I studied in a Soviet university in 1989 and was in Russia a lot privately in the 1990s. And in the early 90s, it was all about business and trying to embrace a liberal democratic concept of economy. And it got hijacked by the wrong people. And while there was a lot of support, there probably wasn't enough support, and it dismally failed. And so there is that scar tissue that I think has brought, that brought that generation into and made it ripe for Putin, who in and out of power for, good God, 14 years, life is better in Russia when you get down to products, goods, distribution. It is better. The 90s were really the nadir. Though there was a hope and an expectation that was sad to see how hard it fell. So generationally, my hope was and still is in their youth, who are very internet connected. I think Russia is 6th or 7th in the world in IT connectivity. But I also worry about the youth because they are on board with a lot of the more irredentist-tinged nationalist stuff that you're reading about today. And that youth was wildly supportive of the success that Russia had, and they did, in Sochi. And Sochi was a big success for Putin. And it came right after this very ugly, or during this ugly period in Ukraine, and kind of offset it. And then right afterwards, Crimea. And the youth were, I remember driving around in Moscow during this time, and huge tailgate parties of Russian youth, like at a Super Bowl with Russian flags and Ukrainian and Crimean flags, and we're number one, was that type of nationalism. And they were really into it. Stalingrad veteran in the middle of the summer says, we were talking about this phenomenon of the youth, and he said, I worry about our youth today because they do not understand the horrors of war. Meaning that even in the heart of the Cold War, you had these Soviet leaders that went through the most barbarous, ferocious, horrifying modern military campaign conflict in history. And they remembered that. Every single family lost somebody either in war, in the purges, or a famine, or the Russian Revolution. The current youth, yeah, maybe there's a little bit back to Afghanistan, and there's some reports now that some of them are getting troubled because of bodies now coming out and disappearing from Ukraine. But youth are fickle. And that 85% that you read about, who are all behind Putin, I'm exaggerating, many are not, could change very, very quickly if the propaganda and this false legitimacy that the regime perpetuates starts to fall on. Remember, these guys are connected, and it could turn very, very badly inward on this Russian regime over time. What we've got to do in the interim is try to work with Russia, connect where we can, and try to steer them, realizing they're going to do their own behaviors from the worst transgressions, and do all we can not to get into brinksmanship with them. Sorry, long answer.
We have a question here from the fickle youth.
Sir.
So at the beginning you were saying how this was a preemptive action mostly from Russia, the invasion of, Crimea and Ukraine in general. This reminds me of the Franco-Prussian War and how it's a very big cause of the First World War. So my question basically is how this new political, military, and economic environment that we live on today will change the outcome of this preemptive military process that Russia is doing in Ukraine.
Okay, so let me be clear. So how will these Russian-backed actions in Ukraine help me with the question?
Yeah, the question is basically comparing to how it was before in the Franco-Prussian War, and given the new environment that we have in economics, in politics, in the military environment that is completely different from at the beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah.
How does these two events are in nature preventive? They want to prevent a situation. So how does these two similar events?
Yeah, the Franco-Prussian War, 1870. I would, if we were going to try to compare, I would look more towards 1912 through 1914, and then I would look at 1936 through 1939. If you're looking for historical, if there are ways to latch some lessons learned from history. And yeah, and you had an expanding Prussia and all of that. I get it. But I think that when we're getting, World War I was all about miscalculation, hubris, pride, and you see this playing out a lot, especially in Russia. Miscalculation, overestimation, and then you add all these other factors. You add that to all these other factors. Again, the irredentism, the propaganda, a group of nations that desperately don't want to go back to war, as was post-World War I Europe, which led to Chamberlain. You have the European Union, and nobody wants to go to war with Russia. Russia knows this, and that allows it to intimidate and to push and to press. But where's the line? And the big challenge that we're dealing with this preemptively defense-offense is that where is that line where we exercise credible deterrence? And where does that credible deterrence line up with provocation to Russia? okay? And that's the sweet spot, and that's the hard spot. And that's why, you know, you're seeing exercises up in the Baltics. But if you don't do anything to support your allies, then you're in the League of Nations again. Okay, good question.
Let me try a variation on this, because so the question that I heard was, you've got Russia behaving in a 19th, early 20th century manner in the midst of a 21st century full of connectivity and connection and the peaceful resolution of disputes between European powers. How did we get to that mess? Is that? Yeah, he was in my class
How
last
did we
semester.
get to that? Okay, I think we go back to 1991, and if we look, if you remember the dialogue out of the West, but also out of the United States, out of Congress, out of a lot of our leaders, we won the Cold War. We won the Cold War, we pretty well had it our way in the 1990s. And while we did a lot for Russia, I think that there was a lot of Russia that fell out in the cold. But also was in the military, and we were doing things with the Russians on the military-to-military side. And got the sense that there was some resentment because of the history. They felt their way was going to be and should be with the West. Then in 1995, you've got Bosnia in the early 90s. You get Chechnya in 94, 95, and that's ugly for Russia. And then you get 1999, you get Kosovo. And Kosovo is really, I think, the real first fracture insofar as how they view NATO, how they view the U.S. We had gotten Russia into stabilization force in Bosnia. It was extraordinary when you consider that you had Russians and Americans and NATO all working together. But it was the brinksmanship of 1999, if you remember, Russian paratroop battalions racing down into Kosovo to Pristina airfield, and it took a British general to talk the American general off the ledge because we were going into brinksmanship with Russia. But it starts in Kosovo, in my mind, where the break begins. And then just a year later, Putin is in. Yeltsin's out. Putin is in. You get, again, the first color revolution in 2004. And these are Ukrainian aspirations. And we're constantly trying to work with the Russians, and there's a lot of military-to-military engagement. I have to tell you, there really is. I was involved in a lot of it. And they were okay. And you get with your Russian military peers, and we'd agree that where we have a lot of differences, it's really how you see the world, we had actually more in common. When you really strip out the ideology and the bad feeling and the baggage, you're looking at the world and, oh my God, we got a lot of the same concerns. Militant Sunni Islam, concerns about resources, moving away from ideologies and into worries about, again, resources. With the Russians, we never killed each other in a big war. Yeah, there were things in 1919 and 1920, but so it didn't have to go the way it's gone. And then there is NATO enlargement. Huge. Where the Russians initially, I think, acquiesced, though painfully so. By the way, I'm somebody that believes hugely in NATO enlargement. Could you imagine, those of you that are historians today, this part of the world, if it weren't in NATO right now, what a mess it would be? Can I just throw that out as a thought? Because there are two things. In the beginning, NATO was there for to block the Warsaw Pact and by obviously the Soviet Union, or the Soviet Union and then by extension the Warsaw Pact. But two, it pulled together a whole bunch of traditionally fractious nations into a military alliance. So they stopped planning and making coalitions against each other in here. And since it's been since in the 70s, since Greece and Turkey and Cyprus, where you've had a conflict among NATO members. We would try to get out and tell the Russians, think about it. Boris, Igor, do you really think Russia would be safer today if there was no NATO? And they'd start, and then the smart ones would stop and think for a minute. I get it. Okay.
Don't you think Russia's a fascist country today?
I think that Russia is schizophrenic. It is trending in a more nationalist and by extension fascist overtones. But there is still a large civil society that would resist such a thing. And oddly enough, Putin, while a nationalist and a patriot and big problems, he's got a strategic political flank to these more extremist nationalist parties. So I would submit it is neo-nationalist, not quite fascist, but certainly all kinds of tendrils headed that way. And we don't know what's going to happen in this government over the next year or two. The influences are there. Certainly it is not communist. And we would think that normally this sort of behavior, it's the old communists doing it. No, you've got this right-wing element that is getting more and more extreme. They'll link it to our great Russian nation. They'll link it to the Russian Orthodox Church. They'll kind of add a messianic aspect to it. And then you kind of tack into this dangerous neo-nationalist fascist world. I don't think we're there yet, but we have to watch it.
General.
Sir.
How much of a factor has it been in the annexation of the Crimea with the old Russian belief that since they have only warm water ports there?
They have only one what?
Warm water ports. And everything else is frozen most of the year. It's been kind of like our manifest destiny. They have to have Azov, the Black Sea to Crimea, and at least passage through the eastern Ukraine.
I agree with you. I think that there is that thought. Again, if you were to take a post-Cold War view, it shouldn't be that. It's really a pre-World War II or pre-World War I view. But yes, that view certainly is there. Sebastopol's long history in Russia. You had the Crimean War back in the mid-1800s. But you watch any non-military, probably half the films are black and white. I love watching Soviet-era films. But many of them about Russian families in in Crimea, because that was their Florida. So it's got a long history. It's all of that. Yes, definitely is a warm water port in Sebastopol. Long history. And I already went back and I mentioned that the 80% of the Russians just believe flat out it's theirs. And don't hurt my head with all the political stuff. So I'm agreeing with you. Sir.
Yes, sir. With all of the cyber connectivity, do you think that there is state-sponsored cyber warfare going on? That is, we hear about the Russian mafia attacking the financial systems. Do you think some of that is state-sponsored?
The answer is I don't know. The Russians the Russians are very cyber adept. I would answer your question that way. And when you see the phenomena, whether or not it is government or patriotic citizens that you get something going on in the world and you can get a small army of patriotic hackers that are, you've got hacker wars going on all the time that we don't see. I can't tell you if the Russian government is involved in offensive military type hacking. I mean, we saw what happened in Estonia a number of years ago. But what I can say is that they are capable. I'm sorry, I danced around that one a little bit. Please. Sir.
Could you look into your crystal ball and tell us how you, I'm sorry, is it on? Could you look into your crystal ball and tell us how you think this might play out in Ukraine, and specifically with respect to is Crimea and the other territory lost forever?
Let's get. I'm going to just get the map back to Ukraine here. All right. Oh, you got it?
Actually, I'll get it. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see here. Crystal ball. Okay, you've given me license. All right. I would submit that this is a hard operational problem for the Russians, especially if you want to keep an aura of what we call implausible deniability. Meaning that even with everything that's been going on here, even with the proxy, the separatists backed, which has been confirmed in places like YouTube, main force Russian units, they live and keep this fiction that Russian forces aren't actually in here. And for all the reasons that we just discussed, both we don't want to play it inside the Russian hinterland where it might not be completely popular, EU and all that for the sanctions and everything else. How it could play out. I think that there would have been a desire to get more of eastern Ukraine. Maybe early on they wanted to get all the way out to Dnieper. We don't know. But there are certainly areas along here that, whether boundaries and all that, that they probably want to straighten or organize if these are going to turn into South Ossetia or Abkhazia type of statelets. Because if these places are now in play, in their mind, I would submit that that certainly NATO and even the EU would have problems bringing in Ukraine into these organizations when you have major problems along this line. Now you've heard of Mariupol, which is about right here. Mariupol is about 500,000 people. It's, I think, the second or third largest steel mill in Ukraine. And if they make a thrust down there, I would project that it would be actually quite bloody. It'd be a big urban fight. And it would take a lot of effort from certainly the separatists, if not main force Russian units, to subdue it. All right, and so watch Mariupol. I think that if they do it, then they truly, the Russians would have to use what I would call starred Russian vehicles, meaning that they declare, all right, we're in. Now that will create some real major reaction in Europe and certainly from us. Now, the other thing that you've been reading about is, gosh, wouldn't it be nice to connect the land corridor to Crimea? Okay? That's about 200 kilometers, 150 miles plus or minus. And as you see the population changes, it's not all pro-Russian. And again, I need to emphasize, even in the Russian areas, among ethnic Russians, it's not all pro-Russian. Okay? So they would have major considerations to take on something like this. I would state that the desire is there. The question is, will they commit? And certainly I believe they have the capability of doing something like that. But now they've got a bigger mess on their hand. Because as we learned in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places, if you're going to go off and try to take, occupy, and pacify an area, that's called hold. Now you've inherited a whole bunch of other problems, and it starts to play back negatively in Russia. You end up with a gigantic Northern Ireland type scenario that would be expensive, 1,000 pinpricks, and would start getting unpopular in Russia. It starts to get the population looking at this society, this regime, who is all about maintaining its false legitimacy. So it has Russia has huge considerations. I think that first and foremost, they want to solidify this, maybe push out a little bit. Maybe it is Mariupol. It's a big move if they do. Anything beyond that is going to be a major, major effort.
I still remember a woman saying on the evening news months ago, a woman in Crimea, a Russian, ethnic Russian, that she wanted to be with Russia. But for one thing, when she retired, she could depend on a check, a pension check, and the benefits coming to her, which she didn't expect from the corrupt Ukrainian, from the Ukrainian government. She wasn't going to do so well. So I'm wondering if these people wouldn't be as sympathetic or nationalistic toward Russia if the Ukrainian government became less corrupt, worked its way away from the corruption that it's had for years, and more economically stable. If this area would settle down a little more with more of the people less anxious to be annexed by Russia. Economics,
Yeah.
if the economics.
Yeah, I think that overall, let me paraphrase, the question is that if the Ukrainian economy and the social network to the Ukrainians, certainly in the more embattled areas, were better coming from Ukraine, would the situation be different, and how important and how much is the factors of corruption in the Ukrainian government creating this problem? Is that kind of? Yeah, it's a central question. Again, we're dealing with a country that's not part of an alliance system. It comes from an absolutely corrupt background that goes. It isn't just Yanukovych; it goes before him. And one of the great concerns in even the eastern Ukraine was that the pensions and the safety network is in some areas still being paid for by the Ukrainians. And one of the things that the Poroshenko government stated, well, all right, Eastern Ukraine, Russia, you want it? You pay all the pensions. You pay all the social safety. And I'm not sure exactly where it is right now. But on the strategic piece, if Ukraine fails economically, it will fail militarily. It will fail. And I'm of the mind that, and I don't think I'm in a minority, that it's got to be well thought out, well managed because of all the corruption. But there's got to be, in some way, a absolutely whole of government mini Marshall Plan, if you will, for Ukraine. And with it comes civil control of the military, which is already going on. And part of that is the absolute finding a way to, as a condition for these major funds, ways to suppress and defeat the corruption. Ukrainians are talking a good game politically about it, but it's so inbred into that life. And you've still got a number of oligarchs in Ukraine that are of that system. So this is hard. By the way, it's good seeing you again. this is hard because EU is counting its pennies. And while there is money that's gone, I think there's another 17 billion that's gone into it, it's going to take much more from them, from us. But if they fail economically, they will fail. And I think this gets at the central problem. Please.
General,
Sir.
I was wondering how much, if at all, you think the current state of our government's basic inability to legislate and the continually decreasing budgets and the potential for more sequestration and its impact on the military might be encouraging Putin to take some of the chances and actions that he is.
I would say that there might have been some of that. I mean, when I first was in Germany 20 years ago, there were over 200,000 military. We were talking about corps and divisions. We're down to 2.5 brigades. The retrograde was on. European militaries are a shadow of their former selves. And the discussion now is on. And if there's anything that's going to turn around the sequestration, which in part I supported, is the type of existential threat that a malign Russia presents. Because in the worst case, Russia really, really goes off track. You're dealing with you're dealing with a potential existential threat of the most deep elemental order. And if there's anything that gets budgets realigned and refocused, in periods of peacetime, it'll be economy and politics. In periods of existential threat, then a lot of money is going to go back into the military and other things. And you see this in Europe right now. Major debate. The European militaries don't want to get, and it's hard for them to even get back to 2%. But the discussion is on. And this is not part of what Putin, I think, originally thought through. So they may be racing against time. Russians don't want to go to war with us. They don't want to go to Europe, the war with Europe. But I will say, as all good military planners, they're preparing to. Okay? They don't want it, though. Okay? And if you're a nation that is basically isolated, almost in pariah status, you have a freak show of allies. Heck, the Soviet Union had more allies. They have to live in the world of preemption, surprise, and asymmetry. Okay? So, don't know. But yes, I think for a while they saw weak Western to include U.S. perception of weak U.S. resolve. Maybe they could work the seams. And now they've kind of woken us up. And I would state, a number of you historians, and they probably know it, or they may miscalculate it, but there's nothing worse in the world and more dangerous than an enraged democracy or democracies. They don't want that. But I think the debate now on sequestration is going to be on. I can tell you for sure that your military is looking hard at this problem now. It's a problem that they didn't want to have, and in the 90s and early 2000s thought that it was going away. And one last question on this is, I think everybody's troubled by the erosion of the arms control agreements, which were not only about limiting numbers of weapons, but also about confidence building. And we don't have a lot of contact with our militaries right now, and our diplomats aren't doing a lot of negotiating. I mean, they work through Iran, and there are some things going on, but it is much, much reduced. And I would submit now we're in this phase of the world with Russia that has now become more dangerous not to talk to Russia than to talk with them. And we're worried about an appearance of weakness and all of that, and being supplicants and appeasement. No, we're strong. And as long as we're affirming our allies, we need to find ways, because I have to believe there are a number of Russians who are unsure about the righteousness of their cause, too. they're very loyal, they're very quiet. But I would submit, inside Russia right now, news isn't all good. Did that kind of get at what you were looking for? We don't want to go this way.
Yes,
Sir.
I have trouble standing, so if you don't mind, I'm going to sit.
No, it's okay.
One of the things I've learned tonight is that and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Putin needs to be careful what he wishes for. I think that Putin risks the loss of his credibility if he fails to respond to what the Russians, and at this point he's got about 80 to 85% of them in his pocket. If he fails to respond to what these people perceive as an affront to their national identity or integrity. So, in your own view, what do you think are the kind of actions on our part that would be perceived as by the Russians as this kind of a threat to their national integrity?
And this is a really, really key question. It gets at the question of we must deter, we must show resolution, we must reassure our allies, but in what actions do we take up to that point that it may be perceived as a real provocation by the Russians? Now, there's a contrived provocation, and then there's that real provocation. It's finding that sweet spot. Because we can't do nothing. We can't sit back with with these type of Sovietish behaviors. But Sovietish and 1930-ish behaviors. So this is we have to be very, very careful on the way when the Russians are out there intimidating and showing the flag and flying their airplanes and ships, that we don't have mistakes or accidents. We have to, again, absolutely be clear with the Russians that if you're going to mess with your allies, you're messing with the entire alliance. That's easier said than done, especially when you're dealing with a number of countries in Eastern Europe, 3 of which used to be part of the Soviet Union. So this is a tricky space that we're in. But I think that over time, if we are patient, our foreign policy is wise, we watch our words. Words matter. When a certain governor in early 2012 called Russia our foes, we in the Moscow embassy had to deal with that for a year. You called us a foe. You called us an enemy. No, that was a politician saying that. Internal American. We are a globalized, interconnected world. And we have to be very careful with the rhetoric to include incendiary rhetoric on our own side. So we're going to have to be sober. We're going to have to be measured. We're going to have to be disciplined. And we're going to have to be firm in our and very, very careful with our messaging. I think that's really, really important in this hyper media world. Words matter. I don't know, did I get at sort of what you're looking for? Ladies and gentlemen, the propaganda machine in Russia today would make Joseph Goebbels proud. It is mind-bending. I would try to get out into the Russian hinterland, and I'd be in a Russian hotel, and I'd turn on nothing but Russian channels. And this was on early on during the Ukrainian crisis, Crimea, Ukraine. And you would get images of swastikas, SS runes interposed with the contemporary Ukrainian fascist, if you will, symbology, and before you, and then you would interpose it with films of ethnic Russian women and children and bleeding and broken houses, and you're getting this 18 hours a day in some of the channels out in the hinterland, which is more television-driven than IT-driven. And after about 6 weeks of this, and I'm an iron ore worker in the Ural Mountains, I want to drop my jackhammer, pick up a Kalashnikov, and volunteer for the Ukraine. Because the propaganda is extraordinary. It's mind-bending, and it goes back to what I've told you, when even our own leaders and other leaders, including Merkel, is lied to their face on things, and we can't handle that. I would submit that U.S. and Western politicians, mainstream with exceptions, they will tell half-truths sometimes, they'll spin things, but they don't do the big lie. In our societies, in our governments, no matter who you are politically, the big lie is going to take you down ultimately. In that whole society, the disinformation, the propaganda, the lies associated is mind-bending. Gets at the 85% that you started with. That's going to ultimately implode on the Russians, on the Russian regime, because it is, in part, a house of propaganda and lies. And in this intermedia connected world, over time, if the news is bad, it's going to turn in. But the problem is that what measures do they take to keep that positive message going, that momentum going that we talked about? And I worry that Russia, and again, I tell you, I like the Russians, and regimes like this almost inevitably end up, be careful how I say this, failed. Okay? The problem, and I worry that this current group is going to lead Russia into a cul-de-sac, but my great worry is they may bring a bunch of nations into that cul-de-sac with them.
Could you comment on the lack of support to the Budapest Agreement?
Lack of support?
The lack of support for the Budapest Agreement in '95, the fact that we didn't honor our commitment to the Ukraine when they got rid of their nuclear weapons. And really the only thing that the Russians understand is force. Stalin used to say that you take a bayonet and push it in. If it's soft, you push it further. If it's hard, you push it back. You pull it out.
Yeah. All right.
And the lack of political will, both in this country and in Europe, to support the Ukrainian people.
All right. 1956 Budapest, Ukraine, and a perception of Putin that our political will is weak and we're not willing to push back. Am I generalizingly correct here? 1956, yeah. Oh, Budapest Memorandum, 1994. Yeah. Budapest Memorandum, 1994, basically basically, and I think it's the U.S., Russia, China, and sign, and Ukraine. Basically an agreement that Ukraine, through the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, all the nuclear weapons and delivery systems are taken out of Ukraine, and with that comes a guarantee of Ukrainian sovereignty and boundaries to include Crimea. And that was grotesquely violated last February and March during the illegal annexation of Crimea. And you're indeed right. Russia was a signatory. And basically, they saw a seam. They moved fast. It was relatively bloodless. It became a fait accompli. It was done, and they said, okay, world, what are you going to do about it? Yeah, they pulled it off. And it gets at your point now at, well, if they try that, well, do we try that somewhere else? And will we balk again? And they better be really, really careful on this. though they are pushing and intimidating another place to include in the Baltics.
Sir, I'm going to invite you to continue the conversation after, folks. We've reached the point where the program has to come to an end. But as a bonus tonight, we do have a little reception set up out in the foyer. So if you want to continue the conversation, please stick around. Otherwise, please give a warm round of applause to General Peter Zwack.